Man, this book just made me want to read Empire of the Vampire by Jay Kristoff even more. Hey everyone, and welcome to the channel. Today I will be reviewing Impact Winter Season 2, and this is an interesting thing. It's not really a book, but it is what Audible calls an audio experience. And you probably saw advertising for the first one of these super hard. I saw it everywhere. I don't know if maybe just some very targeted ads toward me or what, but I saw advertising for this book all over the place, and I think it's included with your Audible subscription. So I picked up the first one and I really liked it. I gave it 4 stars, thought it was super cool. It was very immersive. I thought the story was good, and it had actually scary vampires, which is something I kind of didn't know I needed or that I wanted. I thought it was a lot of fun to actually worry about, vampires, what's going on, and I found it really entertaining. So when I saw that season 2 was out, I was really excited. I liked the ending of the first one and was excited to see where the story went forward. And unfortunately, this book did not deliver for me. One of the big selling points for the series was that the writer of it is Travis Beacham. I'm not 100% sure how to say it, but he actually worked on my favorite movie of all time, Pacific Rim. And so that was one of the things that got me into it. I had a lot of faith in him, and unfortunately, just like Pacific Rim 2, this let me down a lot. I ended up giving it a 2-star rating, which means I didn't really like it. I do think that there are some redeeming qualities to this, and if they came out with a season 3 of it, I would probably listen to it, which I know, why would I read something when I didn't like the second one? And part of it is I just kind of want to see where the story goes. I'm a little bit of a completionist when it comes to books, and unless it's really, really bad, or if the third season was also really bad, I'd probably at least finish out and give it one more chance to see what was going on. But yeah, overall, there's some issues in here with just a few bright spots sprinkled in, and yeah, it let me down. So let's go ahead and talk about some of those things a little bit more in depth, some things that you might like about it, and then some things you might not like about it, things that I did not like about it. So this story takes place in a world that has been hit by a meteor comet kind of thing, and has completely blacked out the sky, which gives vampires the ability to kind of be out at all times. And that is actually one thing I really enjoyed about this world, that vampires aren't a at nighttime threat. They are an all the time problem, because they can be out whenever, because there's no sun. Their biggest weakness is no longer hindering them from being out among the people. And this also just kind of creates an interesting dynamic, because not only is it vampires, it's vampires in a post-apocalyptic setting, which is really cool. And it's not something that I've seen a lot recently. I'll be honest, my most recent experience with a lot of vampire stuff is Twilight. So, that's from when I was like, middle school-ish age. But a lot of times, other than like 28 Days Later, I think is a vampire one where it's, I guess that takes place somewhere specific. But anyways, a lot of times vampires are, stuck in the shadows. They don't get to be out and really be a problem most of the time. And so one great thing this story does is you're always worried. There's no safe time. You're always worried that something is going to happen to a character you like. And, that's really cool. Another thing that I think this world does really interesting is the types of vampires. There's different levels to the vampires, and that is all, based on how you're turned and things like that. So you have your basic brainless kind of vampires that, they just kind of run around, destroy. And then you have upper level ones that are more cognitive. And then, you start to have ones with special abilities and all kinds of things. And I think that's a really nice touch to add, because, you don't want them to just be vampire or to be like a zombie caricature. You want them to have some agency, but having the mix of ones that they're just rabid dogs, rabid animals kind of vampires, really nice. And then you get the mix in this hierarchy, and they have this whole political system that you end up learning about pretty quickly, that, they follow and adhere to. And, it's cool. It's something different, especially from my experience with vampires, where there's different levels to them. And while you're always worried, if you see a specific one, you are definitely screwed. And those are really my biggest positives for this series as a whole, and this book in particular. It's really just the world, the vampire hierarchy, political structure that they have going on. And yeah, I mean, it's cool. It's interesting, but it's not enough to carry this book, because the first book had a good story. It was a mystery. You were really intrigued, page turner, even though it's audio, all those kinds of things. And unfortunately, this book lacked it, and, kind of felt like it rested on its laurels and didn't really push the story forward in a meaningful way. One of the ways it did that, moving into the dislikes here, is it kind of changed the perspective of who our main character is. In the first book, we have a main character, and she's still in this book, and it's not that she's not involved and things aren't happening with her. It's just I felt like maybe half of this book was two points of view of somebody else. And that other person I found to be slightly irritating. I found just a lot of the things going on there to just not work out. I didn't think the story was in particularly strong. And speaking of the story, there is a plot twist that happens in like the last 30 minutes of this book that might be one of the worst plot twists that I have ever read. I just don't know what the thought process was on doing this. You have set a character up to go one direction for basically 2 whole books at this point. And then you just have this character do a complete 180, do something that to me maybe was slightly foreshadowed, but not really. It just kind of came completely out of left field. It felt like a bad, what's that guy's name? M. Night Shyamalan, a bad one of his twists at the end of this book. I could see it maybe being interesting in the next edition of this, but in all honesty, I don't think so. It's not something I really wanted. It's just, you know, it showed maybe that they didn't know what to do with this story, or, you know, it was maybe one of those instances where they were just trying to be too clever. And instead of just following, you know, the narrative that most stories would take and, you know, elaborating on it that way, they tried to just be too different, to look at us, we're doing this differently, this isn't going to be the same old story. But in reality, it wasn't set up to, you know, be better. There wasn't enough for me to find this believable. I think it honestly destroys kind of the character arc we had of this character at this point. It just doesn't seem realistic, it's sad to see something for a character who I had at this point liked for the most part, just kind of 180, and me just, you know, at that point, that was kind of the deciding line for me to make this book a 2-star. Up until that point, I was fine. I kind of liked it. It was probably, you know, right on that line of a 3-star. This chapter happened and I was like, well, I did not like this. So that chapter actually knocked this down a whole star rating for me. And that's not the only story problem. There are just some weird character beats. Not really a huge spoiler here, but there is a conflict that 2 characters have with each other that feels like it comes out of nowhere. They are doing stuff together. They don't really like each other, but this very adversarial, you know, relationship between them has not been established to the point of the conflict that ends up happening between these 2 characters. And it's just baffling that it happened. It felt like it came out of nowhere and was just, honestly, and it was so pointless because it lasted for a chapter and the consequences that it had were basically nil. It wasn't important, even though it was built up to be this big important thing that happened because of the fallout from it. And it just wasn't worth it. And the last negative I want to point out, because this is such an audio experience, there's a pretty distinct problem with some of the sound that goes on. The voice acting and all of that, like the actual quality of the sound and the actors themselves are fantastic. They're great. I really appreciate the work that they did. But because of the formatting of this story, it's just people talking. And so if you don't distinctly remember every single person's voice, you'll maybe get kind of lost on who's saying what to who and who's with who when and who's doing all of these things together. So that can definitely be a little bit frustrating, especially so I listen to my audiobooks at 1.8 times speed. Maybe I should have turned it down for this, but it's what I'm accustomed to listening to. So there are definitely maybe some weird story beats that don't work as well sped up, and you know, maybe that's on me, maybe I should have changed it. But there are definitely some like noises in this book that drove me absolutely crazy. I don't know who thought it was a good idea to have people very wetly kissing each other, but it sounds horrible when you're listening to it. It's who wants to basically listen to somebody like slurping around in their ears? No problem with like people actually kissing in the story, but because of the medium that you're, you know, receiving this in, it is a disgusting, very unappealing noise. It's like hearing somebody chew in your ear or something like that. Like you wouldn't want that. And so this very, very wet kissing, just, oh my God, it drove me crazy. And it happens multiple times throughout the story where it's just like, why are we, you know, subjecting people to this noise? It's horrible. Maybe that's a very specific negative for me. Maybe I'm a little bit more sensitive to some of those noises, but yeah, listening to like slurpy wet kisses of like, almost sounds like a dog going to get water from a bowl was just absolutely horrific for me. So Unfortunately, I really liked the first one, did not like the second one, and I can't say I really recommend you reading the second one. I still would recommend that you read the first one. If you really like the first, I really liked it, and I think most people would. I think it's a really good time, and it's a little bit different from your traditional audio experience. I will go ahead and probably read a third one if it ever happens. It seems like Audible has pushed this series pretty hard, so I'd imagine that maybe it gets one more season. I think I'm one of the few people with a negative reception to it. I looked at some reviews and it looks like it's pretty high up there, at least on Audible it was. So, take everything I've said with a grain of salt, maybe read it for yourself. Let me know what you think. If you have read this, I'd love to hear what other people think. I don't think this is like the biggest thing out there, so I'm a little interested to see if anybody out there has read it. So let me know if you have, or if you want to, now that I've talked about it, down in the comments. And as always, have a good one.